first, a hi and thanks to everybody who is here. I think, wearing a couple different hats. So as new people come in, I will acknowledge them. But we're going to flip over to 2020 that I am super excited to get to do with Mr. Barrow, talking a little bit about behavior and community impact. And then hopefully, and I really feel strongly, and I know I believe Mr. Barrow does as well. One of the key things is to be able to get your engagement, your ideas, and your collaboration on insights we have about that aspect of community impact and behavior once we are done kind of going through this. So, with that said, if it's okay, I'm gonna pass the baton over to Mr. Barrow. I've got a couple places where I'd asked if I could chime in, so I might do that, and then we'll get to discussion.
Super. Thank you.
Hmm.
Everybody can see my screen, I assume.
Yes,
Brilliant. Superb.
Yes.
Right.
That's very
So,
book cover.
um, so before I begin, I just want to say that between Sean and I, there have been no rehearsals, no practice, very little preparation. So therefore, there's only a small chance of this going well. So I just want to set that expectation
That's
before
just
we
the way we
begin.
like it.
right.
Exactly. That was my thinking. We don't want polished. We want good messages, and hopefully that's what we're going to get. So I'm going to talk later in the presentation about the reason that we decided that this would be something good to talk about at OSC, because usually we talk about service management. And I'm not going to talk about service management today. I'm going to talk about the long shadow, and that's the long shadow of our behaviors in the online world and how that might have a community impact. I think we'd all agree that this community represents a collective space where our actions and our words and our behaviors are understood mutually, where we're able to challenge one another and respect one another and enjoy one another. But that's because we've built a community of understanding, and we've grown to understand one another. But what this is about is how our actions outside of a community can cast a long shadow that can first and foremost impact each of us personally, but secondary to that can actually impact the communities that we represent. And that's not this community implicitly, it could be any community that you're part of. So we want to think today about the influence of our words and our actions, and understand if they're uplifting and reflective of the values that we stand for, both as a collective and as individuals. And you'll hear me saying this a lot. This is about the broader narrative of community. I want us all to keep in mind that the power we hold in shaping perceptions and fostering the positivity of this community carries beyond it. Now, I can't see chat or anything like that. So if you've got a question, just shout it out. I'm good with that. And I'm going to just every now and again say, Sean, is there anything you'd like to add as part of our wonderful preparation? So, Sean, is there anything you'd like to add before I go to the next slide?
No, sir. I've loved all the content that you've brought up since the beginning. So I'm like, I went to run until I have maybe one or two things to chip in towards the middle.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I'm going to move on then. So we live in a world today where the power of speech shapes the perception of each of us in this interconnected world, but it does it not in the way that I'm speaking to you now. At the moment, I'm able to provide context. I'm able to provide a pace. I'm able to smile, so you can see that I'm saying something nice. I could, in turn, grimace, so you could see that I'm feeling angry or upset, or I want to make a point. But in the digital world, our words have a much more far-reaching impact, and yet we're unable to express emotion so readily. And this can really ripple through communities, and it can ripple online. And it can, as I say, lead to consequences about how people perceive us. A single miscommunication without any intent to be anything other than what you're saying can snowball into misunderstanding. And I know I'm speaking to an audience here who completely understand that. But the point is, we think it's worth a conversation point. So I'm going to ask each of you a question. We can choose to answer it. You can just choose to think about it. But have you ever considered how your words online could be perceived by somebody halfway across the world? And the reason I ask the question is thus. Sean and I are presenting together right now from halfway across the world from each other. So that's how small the world is. And therefore, that's how far your words can travel really quickly. So just to repeat the question, have you ever considered how your words might be perceived by somebody halfway across the world? And I'll open that to the floor if anybody's got anything they'd like to add.
And I'm seeing comments in the chat from a bunch of
Lovely.
people who are identifying that and kind of saying, yep, familiar with that. Or, yeah, I've been there all the time, resonates more than you know.
Can I say that
Brilliant.
this started as a child? Does how many people remember the little short poem? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, guess what? They do.
Yep.
Okay. And
I,
Smojo,
I
it's as
learned
though you know what's coming next.
I learned years ago when email had just come out, and I wrote an email to a senior AT&T executive that had very inappropriate language, and I got in a bit of trouble for that. So
But
this
it's
resonates
Wait,
deeply with me.
wait, you were probably just talking about the Mets season.
Nice.
You
Oh,
know,
I'm sorry.
it was pretty nasty, actually.
but it's a really good point because it's as though you all know, or maybe I set the question up so you'd all see what was coming in the next slide. So these stats are stuff that I've pulled out over the last few weeks. I've got the sources if you want them. Our online behavior today really does have a material impact on how we're perceived, but perception is becoming much closer to reality than it ever was, in people's minds at least, anywhere in the world. 70%, 73% of hiring managers are using our digital footprint to study us. We're everywhere if we choose to be. And I say that as somebody that's prolific on social media. I use it to promote my brand, so to speak. I use it to promote my products. I have to be really careful now about what I say as a committee member, for example. I said I wouldn't mention service management on this call, and I nearly did just then, as a committee member, or indeed as a member of OSC. Because what I say now has an impact. 85% of hiring managers reject candidates because of something they found online. I'm pretty sure that doesn't mean 85% of candidate rejections are due to this, but it's still a startling statistic. And earlier this year, Forbes reported that 43% of workers believe that their employers monitor online activity, and that most employers would fire staff over certain social media posts. Now, that study actually didn't clarify what it meant by certain, and I think that's another point. There's paranoia developing now. We as individuals are so busy trying to be what we portray that sometimes we can let ourselves down or become paranoid about what we can and cannot say. And we're almost losing freedom of speech to a point as a result. Now, I don't want to talk about politics, but what I mean by that is sometimes it's good to have an opinion. Sometimes it's good to actually challenge an opinion, but it's how we do it. And nowadays, if we do it even at all inappropriately, it can really carry weight globally. So again, I'm pretty sure I'm speaking to a group of people that understand all of this, but I think it's something that's really worth us thinking about as a community, because as we're helping to develop people, as we've talked about, are looking to bring people into this industry and develop them and make them more rounded, skilled individuals, this is now part of the toolbox that we're going to need to help them develop, is how they manage their online presence. And there's elements to this. There's long-term considerations and there's short-term considerations. The first thing to really consider is that short-term versus long-term. we can have a really immediate effect. So John, you spoke about that immediate impact of that email conversation. But imagine that conversation occurred in a social media place. X, for example, Blue Sky, Facebook, wherever you might choose. No longer is it a one-to-one conversation. It's a one-to-many conversation. And the many get to completely misunderstand what you're saying. So there's the short-term impact. Yes, you've offended an individual potentially. That individual can become 100 people very, very quickly. That becomes the long-term perception of you, your brand, and the people that you represent or the communities that you represent. And that brings me to that collective responsibility. Our actions no longer just reflect upon us. And I know I'm guilty of repeating this every single page on this particular presentation. They reflect on the communities that we're part of, which means now each of us has a shared responsibility to act with integrity and to ensure we reflect our community values. And I think as the OSC, we've spent a really inordinate amount of time collectively building our values, expressing our values. And it becomes apparent to me that maybe over time they could be eroded just through some simple, unassuming communication methods. And that's why we need to take actions and accountability. We've talked about social media screening. I'm not saying that we're going to screen anybody in OSC. That's not the point of this, because we're all accountable, we're all able, and we all know what we're doing. But it comes back to how we develop people into the OSC and achieve some of our values. And accountability, therefore, means that our actions should ideally align with both our personal and our community standards. And we do have a set of rules on the community. I think they were one of the first things we published. But I'll be completely honest, I can't remember the last time I read them. And I sit here today speaking about this in the hope that I'm adhering to them and thinking maybe I should have read them before I started this presentation. But the point of what I'm trying to say here is those short-term actions can really lead to long-term impact, but they can also lead to long-term opportunity. It doesn't have to be the negative, it can be the positive. So I know, Sean, you've got a story around accountability of sorts. So this is for me to say, Sean, have you anything to add to this slide?
I love that Olaf chimed in about OSC's rules and values. They are, I believe, both on the LinkedIn homepage, and I hope that while I'm telling this, one of you will shoot that link to that page in there. So I'm really glad that you asked that, Olaf. It would be good for all of us to have it to kind of go back to. I want to bring up to the point that David said, not just verbal communication, but nonverbal, and you might go, well, nonverbal doesn't show up in a post, to which I would go, does it? Because I see an awful lot of expressions on a lot of posts from people's pictures and faces and videos and those things. So many other things communicate to us, and that's what brings me to telling stories and context. And as we're sitting here talking through this, I go, how can I squeak them in short? One of the examples of context that I brought up, where misunderstandings in communication can be so stark, but also tied to different cultures and experience. And I actually now have two of them to sneak in. But one of them I can make really, really fast. And that is that I once had the opportunity in coaching. I used to coach diving. And I got to work with the U.S. national and the U.S. national junior team. And we had the visiting team of the German national team many, many, many years ago. And when you dive, you're on towers, and the towers are stacked. So the 5 meters here, the 7 meters here, and the 10 meters here, right over the 5 meter. So you kind of got to be careful with that. And I was on one side of the deck, and the German coach was on the other side of the deck. And when my divers were ready to go and they would stand on the 5 meter and you tell them, hey, they're prepping for their dive, I would go like this, which most of you would take as what? Good to go, right? How many of you look at this and go, yeah, that means good to go? And that was not interpreted that way by the German coach. When it was his turn for his diver to go, he would go like this, which to many of us looks like, hang on a second. So, two communications, two completely different coaches, but two different cultural experiences. We had
Sorry.
divers. Well,
I
that
am
was,
German. I am German.
is
Sorry.
that wait or
And
is that
that's
your turn? Oh,
this usually in Germany is interpreted as everything's fine. So,
okay.
which would be you're good to go. So, I have no idea how this specific person just turned those two things around.
Well, and this to the point that I think is so valuable in this conversation, which gets me to the other story too, is it's not just cultural differences, it's experience. And those experiences we can't necessarily interpret through a online lens. So the background that would make his team and his culture go, this is your up. And this makes sense if I watched him closely. It wasn't this, it was him pointing and going, it's your turn to this is hold up or this is go is one of those exact kinds of things where your experience translates. The other one I had to kind of sneak in there, and I do this only because so many people are talking about uh, a rather famous ethologist that passed away who did study with research. I got to chase a lot of work with working with animals in communication. And this one is one of those I want to kind of sneak in because it was a story of a couple of species I got to work with at Zoo Atlanta. And one of them was Ivan the gorilla. Now, Ivan the gorilla was a gorilla that was raised in a mall. So I know different story and a whole other bunch of things to talk about on that. But certain things in Ivan's behavior, as you would imagine being in a mall where people were all walking around in an open environment, meant that the training around working with Ivan was very, very different than the work of the other gorillas that were in a zoo in a free range area where people would observe them from behind a fence. When they brought Ivan to interact and move to Zoo Atlanta, we had to introduce him to the other gorillas. And there was a little bit of miscommunication in that. When they introduce animals that are of that size, they use something called a touch me cage. So it's a cage with little tiny holes, but not so much that you can exactly see through. And I think it's a great lens or great metaphor for where we live in social media. I can see part of the communication and I can see what you're saying, but I can't get all of it. Now, as it happens, Ivan was raised in that space with a little thing that he brought with him everywhere, which was his frisbee. It was like his whoopee. He brought it everywhere. If he really liked you and he was good, he would show it to you and let you touch it. When you would put food to him, he would hold out the frisbee and take the food and eat it off the frisbee. So it was like his little beloved thing. So when they introduced him and one of the other gorillas through the touch me cage, which has again the little holes and then a little flat bar under the bottom. It didn't go well. They both started making lots of noise, and yeah, they started jumping around as they do to display and make all kinds of perceptions. But his context in the world that he grew up in, even though the same species, very, very different. Ivan was trained in such a way that they removed a lot of context in which he could be physical with anything else because he could hurt somebody. So that aspect of those things, even though he would jump and display and all of those things, very different from the female in the other cage who would jump around and do the same, but totally okay to touch. In him jumping around, he really got her agitated, and she reached through the touch me cage and did one of the behaviors that was common among gorillas in those spaces, which was grooming. So she tried to poke her fingers through the cage as if to groom. Hey, I'm friends with you. This is what we do. Ivan had been taught never, 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 never deal with touch because you could hurt somebody. So Ivan all of a sudden see these two random fingers poking through a cage. What do you think Ivan did? No one?
Broke 'em.
Smashed the fingers against the edge of the cage. What is this poking at me? This is bad. As you might imagine, that communication didn't go so well. But things escalated from there, right? So she jumped all over the place and he jumped all over the place. And in so doing, he accidentally kicked the frisbee under the cage. His beloved Whoopi went under and into her cage, which in that parlance and the gorillas that were interacting with each other was like, hey, everything's good now, right? Because you just offered me food. You've given me a gift. So what do you think she did? Tried to eat the frisbee. Because as you would, right? That's what gave her a gift. The point to any of these, and things got worse from there. They kind of de-escalated. But the thing that really made it is David was showing this presentation that I was thinking of is online, we really, even if we have different cultures, and Olaf, that was a great point. Your experience in cultures may be the same thing, but your personal experience and your background doesn't begin to touch the things that we can't see through that cage or we can't see through that social media lens. So even things that may feel like this is perfectly acceptable may be different from the people experiencing that. And that's the part I wanted to kind of sneak in from other stories, other angles. And yeah, I think I got that in under 5. I tried.
Oh, thank you,
Job
Sean.
well done.
Very well done. And it's a really interesting concept. So not quite to Ivan levels, but there is actually a reason, and I kind of alluded to it at the beginning of this presentation, as to why we've chosen to present something that's completely non-service management related. The long shadow, and the reason I chose to call it the long shadow is because those behaviors, the way we speak, reaches far beyond us. And Ivan's frisbee is kind of a case in point. It was way beyond him. It was somewhere else. It was in another room, and yet it still stimulated a reaction and a behavior that nobody was in control of. And I've literally just made that up on the fly. But that's kind of the point of the long shadow. So here's a very real story that is very relevant to each of us. So about 2.5 months ago, a member of the OSC board was approached. And they were approached by somebody that's not a member of the OSC. And that person said, I do not want to join the open service community because I do not believe the values that it portrays, because I've seen online somebody misportray those values. Now, we are not the police, and we are not here to investigate, to suggest whether that person was right, wrong, or indifferent, or indeed whether the person that they had spotted online speaking in a way that they weren't appreciative of was right, wrong, or indifferent. But it did lead us as a board to having a conversation to say, maybe we do need to highlight the rules. And we've discovered in the chat that we've been guilty of not doing that. So we need to do a better job of that. Maybe we do need to have a conversation that says, as an open service community, what we say, what we do, how we act, and how we do all of those things inside and outside of the community is reflective upon the individuals within it and the community itself. And that genuinely is why we're sat here today discussing the long shadow. Again, it's just for us all to think about next time we're doing something. We're not the police and never intend to be so. But there are some things that we believe, we can consider as we're going forward. And I'm pretty certain, I'll say it once again, I'm preaching to the converted here, but it's always good to give ourselves a reminder. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a proficient social media poster. I do it to meet my own ends. But even in my day to day, I now represent an organization that I don't directly work for. I represent committees that I don't directly work for. I represent this community and others that I also don't work for. And I also represent myself. So now I have to consider all of those things when I'm communicating, and I'm not an expert in any of these fields. But this, between Sean and I, is just a few things to think about next time we're online. So we've said that from a communication point of view, our actions echo throughout the community, but they echo outside of the community too. That echo has grown longer. So let's make sure that we're positive, respectful, and thoughtful in any future communication. We also need to be aware. We must remain conscious that actually, as members of this community, all of us have an online voice. And if I'm being completely transparent, some of us, for whatever reason, are regarded as influencers or voices or top thinkers, and all of this narrative that really is, in my opinion at least, a bit of a nonsense. But that means what we say can have a really far-reaching effect. And if there are people that want to join this community, the very same people that we talk about on a weekly basis, saying we want to give people a voice who don't have one, we want to allow people to present who don't normally present, we want to develop our industry, there's a slight danger that those of us that have a voice could put those people off by how we act online. And that means we need to reflect. So I've certainly been more reflectionable. Is that the right word? Is that even a word? But I reflect more as I write online because I've grown to realize that, as I said at the beginning, I represent more than just myself nowadays. And it's difficult for me because I'm opinionated. I challenge, but I now need to understand how I do those things appropriately so I don't shed any long shadow from myself onto those that I represent. And I know there's a few elements on the next slide, Sean, that you've prepared as well to sort of bring this to life.
Yeah, and to me, it was really cool when we first were having this discussion that when you brought up that idea of a long shadow of communication, I loved it as a metaphor that carries on. But it hit me as a discussion as we pivot to let's all get engaged in talking about this was just that aspect of how do we actively in this group build a discussion from which we could come up with principles that we could use in posting to both be conscious of that long shadow, but also to learn from it. And so, from my perspective, one of the things was trying to understand other experiences in other cultures. From getting some of the opportunities I've had working with animals and working with many different areas in different fields, I've kind of gotten that sense, but I've also become more curious. Now, when I interact with almost anybody and anything, I'm always wondering, what's your backstory and what's your context? And I think having that before we post is a good step to that, or learning to ask yourself. But I feel like this gives us the opportunity to pivot and have those conversations. What are the tools and techniques that we can use to either A, take that other person's context or experience or consider contexts or experiences that we maybe couldn't possibly imagine because on the one hand we can't imagine all of them, but on the other we need to be sensitive to them. So how do we do that? And that's kind of where I feel like we open this conversation into places we can collaboratively contribute and come up with things that could be contributory. As Mr. Barrow said many times, these pieces are things we're preaching to the converted, but together we could come up with concepts, principles, and fundaments that could be shared in our larger community for people who maybe aren't the converted or who maybe could learn from that. So that was what I wanted to add with regard to this. And that was it.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
And so, massively over time, but hopefully for good reason, um, that was the long shadow. And we are now, as always, over 2020 at that point where we'd like to open it for discussion. I've seen some great points in the chat that maybe we could talk about too. But yeah, over to everybody else, and I'll stop sharing now so I can see you all.